I'm agnostic, but I genuinely think there are only two serious options on the table: Christianity or atheism. And I know that sounds intense, but I'm going to explain why. I've been thinking a lot about whether or not I want to change the direction my channel is going in. I think I am going to continue to make music as slowly as I tend to make it, and as inconsistently as I post. I'm going to try to be better. I'm going to try to have at least one video a week, but even then I'm not making any promises. At the same time, I've been consuming tons of content surrounding Christianity, atheism, and other religions, and I want to start documenting the most honest version of that search. Now, I do want to start off by saying this. When I say I'm agnostic, there are only two viable possibilities that I have been able to find so far. Either it's Christianity or it's atheism. Now, in the future, I can get into my reasons for why I think that, but I thought I would start there. It's not to say that other religions cannot possibly be true. I'm not claiming that. But due to what look like internal incoherencies and contradictions that a lot of them possess, I think they are unlikely to be true. Not impossible, who's unlikely. One of the reasons I wanted to make this is because I've been consuming some atheist content. And one of the things I've noticed is that Christians tend to do a pretty good job of arguing what atheists actually believe. They just disagree with it on a probability standpoint and disagree with them on a But I have noticed that a lot of atheist content tends to misrepresent what Christians believe in order to make their points. Not all atheists. Not even close, but enough popular content that it matters. And one of the things I find interesting is how strong the case for Christianity can be. Yet people tend to act as if it's a fairy tale on the scale of Santa Claus or the Tooth Fairy. You'll hear commentary at exactly that level, like, Christianity is basically the same thing as believing in Santa. But here's the thing. We actually have evidence to suppose that Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy do not exist, in the sense that we basically know how the evidence for them happens. If a bunch of kids came to you and said, "I believe in Santa Claus," that is not the same kind of claim as a bunch of grown adults coming to you and saying, "I saw someone get kidnapped." And frankly, it wouldn't even be the same level as a bunch of adults saying, "I saw Bigfoot." I'm personally agnostic toward Bigfoot too. I don't know if Bigfoot exists or doesn't exist. And honestly, I'm kind of indifferent to it, because Bigfoot has no relevant effect on my life. So it's not necessarily that I believe in Bigfoot or I don't. It's more that I don't really care. But the same claim cannot be made about God, whether you're atheist or Christian. Because with eternal life on the line, it's hard for anybody to argue that this is irrelevant. This question affects everybody. Now, with Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy, we know how the evidence comes about. A kid says, "I was told a tooth fairy would come and replace the tooth I put under the pillow with money. I woke up the next morning and there was money. Therefore, the Tooth Fairy exists." But we as outsiders know that evidence is fabricated by loving parents. That's distinct from the case for Christianity, because the counter-evidence isn't knowledge in the same way it is also belief. It could have happened, or it could not have happened. We're dealing with claims about history, claims about events, claims about testimony, claims about bodies missing, claims about people saying, "He ate with us," and so on. So one point I'm making is that it's a false category comparison, and sometimes it gets turned into a false dichotomy, like, either you don't believe in anything, or you have to believe in everything. And therefore all evidence is equal for all claims. But that's not how reasoning works. Now, I want to be clear again. I am currently agnostic. I don't know. And frankly, I kind of switch back and forth on which one I'd prefer to be true. I would say the majority of the time, though, I lean toward wanting Christianity to be true. Now, this is likely going to take multiple parts, so we'll call this part 1. And in part 1, I want to get some of the smaller or weaker arguments out of the way, arguments that I think are often presented badly online, before we move into the strongest objections. And then the strongest case. So here's a weak one I hear sometimes. If an all-loving God exists, we wouldn't expect to see evil, but we see good as well, so the evil can be outweighed. And then people try to say the same case could be made for an all-evil God. But the thing is, in the comparison between an all-good God and an all-evil God, the priors are not symmetrical. Even an atheist will argue that things are good and bad, even if they think it's subjective. A lot of atheist content argues we live in a subjective world, and a lot of them argue the world is deterministic. Not all of them agree on determinism, but almost none disagree that morality, what is good and bad, is subjective. So for the sake of argument, I'm going to remove morality entirely from this specific point. I'm not going to argue this from the existence of moral absolutes. I'm going to define good as existencefulness and evil as privation. So when we say something is all good under this framing, it's the maximum existence of certain great-making qualities: power, rationality, love, sacrifice, positivity, whatever you want to call it. Now, it would be weird for an all-evil God to exist. Not impossible. Just weird because it would mean you have a being with all great-making properties except for one. It's all-wise, all-powerful, but for whatever reason, it lacks the great-making quality of good. That would be an anomaly. It would be less what we would expect than a God that has the full set of great-making properties. Now, another point I hear is, we've explained more now. Therefore, God does not exist. And I actually want to be fair. Here, I don't think the core idea is automatically weak. You don't think it is fair to say that as we gain more knowledge, the gaps shrink, and using God as an explanation for random unknowns becomes less convincing. That's fair, but it tends to be overextended. People will say, we used to attribute lightning and disease to God. Now we don't. Therefore, God is just ignorance. And while it's true that people used to attribute lots of things to deities, this doesn't represent Christianity's core claims. Religion can be traced back to extremely early civilization, and there's even some evidence to suggest that there was a kind of high god. Concept in early religious thought some supreme authority, figure even if that idea wasn't articulated the same way, or given the same name, until later. Now, I'm not saying that proves Christianity. I'm saying belief in God isn't just a modern mistake that only came from not understanding lightning. And even in the Old Testament, yes, God uses naturally explainable things, storms, disease, and so on, but those are presented as anomalies, not as the claim that everything naturally explainable is automatically God did it. God can use something that is naturally explainable without it meaning that it is always an act of God. So, the God of the gaps critique, while sometimes fair, is often aimed at a version of Christianity that isn't quite accurate. Now, another thing I want to clarify is atheism versus agnosticism, because this gets muddied a lot. Some people say atheism isn't a belief. It's just a lack of belief. But that's a really weak definition, because lack of belief is basically agnosticism. I don't know. In philosophy, atheism is typically treated as a positive claim. God does not exist. Theism is the opposite claim. God exists. Now, you can have variance in confidence levels. You can be less sure than someone else on the same side. But leaning is different than I don't know. You can call yourself an agnostic atheist or an agnostic theist, and that's fine as labels. But at the end of the day, you're still associating with a side based on how you weigh evidence. And I'll say this. If all the evidences for God fell apart tomorrow, I wouldn't automatically assume God doesn't exist. I would become a strict agnostic. It would bring me to zero. It wouldn't bring me into the negatives. Because atheism also has positive claims that people act like don't exist. Atheists do have evidence for the lack of a God. Christians might disagree with it, but it exists. And I don't like when people pretend atheism has no claims. It does. Now, another argument people throw around is that God is evil in the Old Testament. And I want to separate two things. The problem of evil is serious, and that deserves real attention. But the viral God is evil in the Old Testament argument is often presented in a really sloppy way. A lot of the time it boils down to, we can find things in the Bible that we think are wrong today. Therefore God is bad. Now, to be fair, someone could strengthen that argument and add more qualifiers. But that's basically what the viral version is. Here's part of the issue. We are a progressive society. We build, we improve, we refine systems over time. Christianity already has a strong moral foundation in the Ten Commandments, which is arguably an incredibly strong basis for morality. And then Jesus later expands and deepens that moral vision in Christian theology. But even with a strong foundation, you would still expect exceptions and accommodations in an ancient world. If God gave the full, perfect moral law with no accommodations, no scaffolding, no context, I don't even know if the ancient world could sustain it. And even if they could, humans would still alter and refine how they apply it later, because that's what we do. Look, eti, mat. The fundamental principles don't change, but we develop more equations, more formal systems, more applications. We extend and refine. Now, to be fair, someone might not point to the 10 Commandments. They might say, no, some of the things God commanded are evil, like the killing of entire societies. Here's what I'd say to that. First, Christians are not strict on a single interpretation there. There are multiple serious Christian views about how to interpret those passages. And there's something awkward about the online debate dynamic. Atheists often argue morality is subjective, so it's not obvious how you can say, this is objectively evil, without importing an objective moral standard. But even setting that aside, here's an analogy we literally did in high school. If we had a time machine, and we could go back in time, and we knew what Hitler would do, and we killed him as an infant would, that'd be morally reprehensible. Many people would say, no. But when we apply that same standard to God, people often change their answer. Because think about it. God is timeless in classical theology. He's aware of everything that has happened, is happening, and will happen. If that's the case, there's no reason to suppose that him stopping evil people is automatically wrong before we even know they're evil. If he has perfect foreknowledge, that changes how the moral framing works. Now, the second point is about language and genre. A lot of Christians believe that some of the Old Testament war language is hyperbolic. Hyperbole is extremely common in ancient war rhetoric. And some people will say, well, if it uses hyperbole, then it makes the Bible unreliable. But that's not what that actually means. Yes, hyperbole makes a document less reliable in one narrow sense. You don't read it as woodenly literal in every line. That's literally how hyperbole works, but it doesn't automatically mean nothing happened, or the narrative is fake, or the whole thing collapses. It means you interpret the genre and rhetoric correctly, which is what historians do. So when someone tries to use hyperbole to say the Bible is unreliable, what they often mean is, I want to read it in the most literal possible way, and then criticize it for not being literal. But that's not a fair historical approach. So yathos are a few of the weaker ones I've been seeing recently. This is part 1. I'm going to do more, and I'll respond to weak arguments from both Christian and atheist sides. It just so happens the atheist content was what I watched most recently. Thank you for your time and for watching. If you've got any music suggestions for me to make, I'm open to them. And if you want to see more content like this, like, subscribe, and comment what you'd like to see next.